Thank you. We go to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just make clear for the record that after being unjustly jailed for 3 years, Igor Bitkov and his wife, Irina, who spent 3 months unjustly jailed, and their daughter, Anastasia, another 3 months for being unjustly jailed. Igor got out on bail, but they were told they're not free. They are under house arrest. I just confirmed it again within the last couple of minutes with their attorney, that they are under house arrest. Significantly on May 23rd, and I mentioned earlier before in terms of the chronology, right before, 2 days before my hearing, which was in this room, the court ruled and allowed them out of jail. That was the Constitutional Court. That wasn't enough for CSIG, however. On May 23rd, CSIG went back to the Constitutional Court in yet another action against the Bitkovs.
This would be the third.
Yes.
The third time.
And so there's a pattern, I think, here. On June 21st, the Constitutional Court, in contrast to its previous decisions, exonerating the Bitkovs under the Palermo Protocol. I remind my colleagues that under Palermo, and we're talking about migrants. These are asylum seekers, a family that was escaping the impunity of Vladimir Putin and his cronies. Article 5 makes clear that migrants shall not become liable to criminal prosecution under the protocol for the fact of having been the object of conduct set forth in Article 6 of the protocol. And then it is clearly pointed out that producing a fraudulent travel or identity document, procuring or providing and possessing such a document. So, you know, the Palermo Protocol couldn't be clearer, and anyone who doubts that they were escaping a tyrannical action against them, just look at the record. It couldn't be more clear. So the Constitutional Court now has allowed a C6 action based on, because the Bitkovs got false driver's licenses and credit cards. Again, they wanted to change their identity. We have witness protection in this country when someone wants to change their identity in order to escape the mob or the mafia, in this case, the Russian mafia. And now they're bringing another action. What is, and I would ask with respect, what is the driving force behind CSIC after first being part of an action that got 19 years for Igor, 14 years in prison for his wife, and 14 years in prison for their daughter? I mean, that's what the judge found. That's what the court found. What is the driving obsession here? I mean, when you say there's been an investigation, you found no evidence, how deep was that investigation? How much was looked into the Russian connection here? You know, we know for a fact that thousands of business women and men in Russia routinely have their businesses taken away from them. I cut my eye teeth on Russian human rights issues in 1982 in my first term on a trip to the Soviet Union on behalf of Soviet refuseniks, Jews who wanted to emigrate, including people like Yulia Kasharovsky, great people, who then they had all of these false charges brought against them, often were sent to psychiatric prisons or places like Perm Camp 35, and I actually visited Perm Camp 35 in the Ural Mountains just a few years later and heard horrid tales of men who had been taken and tortured by the Russians, in that case the Soviets. But now we have a continuation of that, and again, the Russians went looking for the Bitkovs, took them several years, and then they found them, and had a willing partner called CSIC to join in the efforts, and it's all laid out in nauseating detail, unfortunately, and yet there are people who suggest this is an overreach on our part, trying to raise these issues. And I said it before, Bill Browder, he is the subject of attacks unrelenting by the Russian government, unrelenting. I was in a bilateral at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly as head of the United States delegation these last 5 days in Germany. And at that meeting that was chaired by Peter Tolstoy from the Soviet side, from the Duma, was some of the people who had been held to account under the Magnitsky Act in terms of their wrongdoing. They were sitting right at the table and took great umbrage at the Magnitsky Act. They don't like it. We believe in sanctions. We believe in personalizing them as a way of really trying to inhibit bad behavior and hold to account. But now we have a situation where a family who is at grave risk, in my opinion, their physical safety is my overriding concern. I want to keep them out of prison because I think they have done no wrong. They have done what any of us would do for our families if a gangster group came after us, and certainly changing a passport to a new name, certainly having a driver's license with a different name, and now CSIC is going after them because of their driver's license. I mean, it begs credulity. It's just, it's beyond the pale as to why. Can you tell us why?
Sir, I can't speak to the particularities of how CSIG works internally. I will say, in terms of beyond what I told you about the Bitkovs before, our embassy has engaged with the Guatemalan government. We've got assurances from them that they will not send the Bitkovs back to Russia.
If I could interrupt, would the gentleman yield?
And there is no extradition.
How about the son? Since the Russian banks are now asking that the young son, who's maybe under 3 years of age, be returned from Guatemala to Russia. Do you have assurances of that too?
I hate to admit this, but you've exhausted my expertise in this subject, and rather than mislead you, I think I'd rather get back to you.
If the gentleman would yield. Ambassador, I would suggest in a situation where you're looking at sentences of 17 years, 14 years for the wife, 14 years for the daughter who had been, after the bank tried to, after certain individuals in the bank tried to take control of the company, had been abducted and raped in St. Petersburg for 3 days, for her to get 14 years, for the younger son to be in a situation where the Russian government is trying to have him return to Russia. And given the past pattern of behavior, you would have to ask yourself, when these sentences are longer than sentences for drug trafficking, for murder, for even terrorism in country, there is something a little unusual about the particulars of this case. And that is why, when I said earlier, we're going to work with US-UN on investigations here in terms of this set of circumstances, it is, I think, incumbent upon all of us to dig a little deeper and get a little bit more understanding of this case. And I would ask you to do that and then get back in touch with Chairman Smith and myself and other members of this committee that are interested, because at the end of the day, our goal is to have CSIG work effectively. They're in an environment where they're taking on corruption. But the one thing you and I know is that the Russians try to influence the outcome in any case where they go after anyone who tries to flee their government's control. And if you ask yourself, how far will they go? Apparently, poison by radiation is not out of bounds. We know of 2 cases where that was done in the UK. So when you have an arm of the state, a state bank, bringing a case in Guatemala after bringing a case where they had previously, anyway, I've exhausted our time, but I think Chairman Smith made the point, and I would just reiterate it. At the end of the day, we want CSIG to be effective. For that to happen, we need the reforms in place. And but again, I see Mr. Cook here. Were you seeking time?
No, I came back in because we're planning a trip as part of my committee to Guatemala. And obviously, this is a huge, huge issue. I'm one of the, we're all concerned about it. I know, Ms. Torres, it's something that we're concerned, and I share the chairman's feelings about Russia and their history. And so this is something that's not going to go away, and obviously this is going to be our top agenda when we go down there. Thank you.
If I could just conclude, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, yes.
And I thank you for
Yeah, yield
your
back.
comments. To the Bitkovs, they live with the sword of Damocles hanging over their head every single day. I mean, they got very poor treatment in prison. They had a huge, huge SWAT-like team take them to prison in the first place, totally beyond all reason. And what that has done, especially to Anastasia, who was abducted, and this is the way the Russian oligarchy, the Russian leadership works. They go after businessmen and women who are successful to fleece them, and if you don't play ball, they set examples for certain people. To think that CSIC has anything to do with that absolutely undermines their mandate. Who doesn't want to get rid of corruption? Every single one of us. But if personnel is policy, which I think it is, and there are any corrupt people within the organization called CSIG, that needs to be weeded out, and beyond that, not just weeded out. Anyone who is complicit in any of this, that's why I've asked very specific questions about collusion, they need to be prosecuted. And no games. I thank you.
Okay, with that, we thank the